Okay. Hi, I'm Lucas Carroll, and I'm going to tell you all about Deleuze's understanding of individuation and being in relationship to certain scholastic authors. Um, I want to, first of all, justify why it is that my interest is to discuss Deleuze in relationship to scholasticism. Uh, it can seem as though there is nothing further, no ontologies further from one another than Deleuze's atheistic, materialistic, purely immanent, um, Spinozist inspired metaphysic of difference. Um, than, for instance, Aquinas with his explicitly hierarchical, um, uh, moralizing view of being, where the pureness of being is God, who is pure unity, goodness, has a personhood, is a creates according to some kind of intention. As opposed to the pure Deleuzian being, which produces in subjects stupidity, is described as malevolence, as pandemonism, as a whole variety of what seem to be explicitly distinguished or other terms than that which we find in Aquinas. Um, so first of all, we have to give some kind of explanation as to why it is that these radically different ontological perspectives would have anything to say to one another, and where they would have something to say to one another. So with that, I want to paraphrase a couple quotes from contemporary Deleuze scholars on this particular point. One of them is Susan Kaufman, who wrote at the beginning of her book, The Dark Precursor, um, that in the introduction, she says that Deleuze and his project is actually closely related to that of scholasticism. There's a kind of formality and a kind of attentiveness to what have been considered scholastic problems that we find in both Deleuze and of course in scholasticism, with a variety of related themes. Not the least of which being the concern with the univocity of being and the analogy of being, questions of individuation, of the reality or unreality of universals or commonality within being, questions about movement, genesis, concerns of the metaphysics of substance, a whole variety of these related issues are shared in common between the Deleuze of difference and repetition and the whole span of particularly late scholastic philosophy from the 12th century until its end in Descartes. Um, Further, we can say, following James Williams in his essay on difference and repetition within the Cambridge Companion to Deleuze, that difference and repetition has a kind of internal density as a work and is productively reread in contraposition to a variety of other authors who could be considered the inspiration for the work or the antagonist in the work, and that we actually find a new difference in repetition with each rereading in terms of whoever occupies this privileged position. The terms of the book, he says, come out more. They come out more clearly in different orderings. Their internal relationships will be distinguished or will be different depending on who we say is the antagonist or the inspiration. So it's in light of these two particular theses that I want to say it might be helpful to consider Deleuze and his distinctive metaphysical project in Difference and Repetition, in contradistinction to certain scholastic authors, in particular in contradistinction to Thomas Aquinas. Um, but I don't think that this is solely of interest for a new way of approaching or ordering the various terms within Deleuze's famously difficult work, Difference and Repetition. Um, I don't think that this is the virtue of pursuing such a contradistinction or interconnection is exhausted in finding another way to enter into the Deleuzian labyrinth. But further, I think this is really helpful for anyone within the neo-scholastic tradition who find the questions and the resources of scholastic philosophy um, continually valuable, and who continue to work on these resources. Um, I think it would be very helpful to understand the way that a thinker such as Deleuze would criticize maybe certain elements within our scholasticism that are axiomatic within a scholastic framework. Because what this helps us to do is to further analyze and dive deeper into, um, for instance, a scholastic Thomistic metaphysic, to better understand our concept of being, perhaps at a deeper level in light of criticism that, as of yet, I don't believe has truly been leveled against Thomistic ontology. So, with this setup, I think we can say this would be a productive conjunction of Aquinas and Deleuze. And the question is then to say, what is an appropriate neighborhood for this conjunction or this confrontation? Um, and once we've discovered whatever this appropriate neighborhood is, what is that within this region um, that will uh, that will be the main term of their distinction? What is it that they're going to disagree on? So I think that in light of um, the fact that both Deleuze and Aquinas are clearly elaborating very distinctive theses on the nature of being, that it is appropriate for us to say that the neighborhood of our contraposed analysis will be as regards their metaphysics. And the particular issue that will be involved will be to say whether it is that both of them are able to account for an understanding of individuation in terms of the theories of being that have been proposed. Um, I believe the selection of Aquinas out of the scholastic tradition is not accidental. Deleuze in Difference and Repetition on page 37, I believe. I kid, on page 35, says there has only ever been one ontological proposition. Being is univocal. There's only ever been one ontology, that of Duns Scotus, which gave being a single voice. So for anyone who's familiar with scholastic debates, you know that as soon as you have extolled the name of Duns Scotus, you've offended a lot of Thomists. Um, uh, and further, Deleuze's work continues throughout, and especially in the conclusion of Difference and Repetition, to chastise the analogy of being as an insufficient approach to ontology. Um, for those who are unaware, when we're talking about the analogy of being, this thesis the being is analogous or is said in many ways, has tended to be traced back to Aristotle and Book Gamma of the Metaphysics. But the term analogy and the explicit elaboration of what an analogy of being would mean, as opposed to something like an equivocity of being, um, was first begun by Albert the Great. Um, and it was carried on by Albert the Great's most famous student, Thomas Aquinas. So when uh, Deleuze is criticizing the analogy of being, and he's placing in its stead the univocity of being, we can clearly see the target of this attack is the tradition of analogy that finds its most, I would argue, most capable proponent in Aquinas. Um, so, uh, what we have to try to do is to understand what Deleuze's criticism of analogy is. He says on, I'll do it this time, on page 38, I was right, on page 38 of Difference in Repetition, he gives us uh, that which he believes analogy is incapable of answering, um, which is, he says, it's henceforth inevitable that analogy falls into an unresolvable difficulty. It must essentially relate being to particular existence, but at the same time, it cannot say what constitutes their individuality, for it retains in the particular only that which conforms to the general, matter and form, and seeks the principle of individuation in this or that element of the fully constituted individuals. Um, he says again on page 303, one page away from the end of the work. So, right here at the beginning in the first chapter, Difference in Itself, and then in the conclusion, Difference in Repetition, um, he says that within analogy, everything takes place between generic difference and specific difference, that the genuine universal is missed no less than the true singular. The only common sense of being is distributive, and the only individual difference is general. So, from beginning to end of Difference in Repetition, he's critical of the analogy of being, and he's critical of the analogy of being for the same reason, which is that ostensibly it cannot account for individuality. So, it's helpful here for us to say, why is it that analogy is incapable of accounting for individuality? Um, because if we stop merely at this assertion, it is an extremely bold claim. It's a claim that is not immediately intuitive as to why it is that an analogy of being would be unable to say what constitutes the individuality of individuals. Um, so we have to tie this assertion to something further in Difference in Repetition, or perhaps a few places further in Difference in Repetition, that would help to flesh out why this is a failure, an alleged failure of the analogy of being. So, in order to do this, um, it would be very helpful if later on in the work, Deleuze offered us that argument explicitly. If he picked up this theme and said, as I said earlier, um, analogy can't account for individuation. Why? Because, and then gave us his argument. But of course, Deleuze does not do that. He gives us a whole variety of very interesting concepts, breathtaking in their complexity, in their interconnections, and their density. But it's up to the careful interpreter to try to flesh out precisely why an assertion is in fact a conclusion. So, in order to do that, I think what we have to do is first of all give a bit more of an explanation as to what the analogy of being entails essentially, in order to then discover um, this, whatever it is that the analogy of being contains essentially, resurfacing later in difference and repetition, um, I, as this relates to the possibility or impossibility of accounting for the individuality of the individual. So, with this in mind, I want to refer refer you all to this wonderful book, "The Metaphysical Thought of Thomas Aquinas" by John Whipple. Um, this is, I think, it's my favorite secondary source on Aquinas, and it opens up the first couple hundred pages are trying to work out Aquinas's distinctive solution to the problem of the one and the many, um, and his distinctive solution to this Parmenidean impasse that much of Western philosophy is constrained to try to account for. This Parmenidean impasse is, of course, that it seems as though being alone is, for to say of that anything otherwise than being is to say of what is not, by definition, that it is, and to say of what is not that it is a contradiction. And so the only that which is only being, and being is then unmultiplied, undivided, incapable of coming into being or passing out of being, and all of these various elements would be cast into the domain of appearance, or the domain of opinion, rather than that of truth or aletheia. So the question is always, to how is it that we're supposed to go about accounting for the multiplicity of being? Um, Whipple argues that Aquinas' solution is the same as that of Plato in the Sophist. Plato's Eleatic stranger in the Sophist um, says to Theaetetus, he essentially apologizes and says, please don't, you're going to have to forgive me for my patricide. And Theaetetus, rightly confused, is like, what do you mean? The Eleatic stranger explains, well, we're going to have to go against Father Parmenides and say, in order to account for multiplicity for the purposes of the dialogue, um, and what this requires is saying that in some sense, what is not is, and in some sense, being is not. These two elements that from Plato on seem to be constitutive of an account that is otherwise than Parmenides, or one that provides ontological principles to account for multiplicity within being. So um, Whipple claims that Aquinas holds to a similar view. If we look at the text of Aquinas' commentary on Boethius's De Trinitate, we find, I think it was in question 4, we find the where Aquinas lays this out explicitly. He's commenting on a piece within Boethius, where Boethius says that otherness is the principle of diversity, and so the otherness of place is the principle of numerical diversity. And Aquinas, commenting on this section, asks, is otherness the principle of plurality? And his argument goes to essentially reduce otherness to reduce otherness or difference to what is primarily diverse. And the primarily diverse is what it is that, as opposed to the secondarily diverse, is that which of itself is other than, or of itself is otherwise than the other. And so what is primarily diverse in Aquinas as he works this out is being and non-being. So when we have multiplicity within things, this secondary diversity has as its principle a primary diversity. And the primary diversity is that of being and non-being. So what this entails is that as an ontological principle within entities of some kind, in fact, we'll see that they're entities of a very particular type. Um, as an ontological principle within these entities, we have to have both a principle that which is that by which the entity has its being, and then an a different principle, which is that by which the entity is distinguished, or that by which it is other than other beings. Um, so this is conceived in this work on Boethius's De Trinitate as the only possible solution to the question of multiplicity in being. Um, so if we consider what this structure is a little further, we can say, well, what Aquinas has said we require in order to account for multiplicity um, is a principle otherwise than pure being. A principle otherwise than pure being, the essential function of which is to do what being alone and in itself was conceived as incapable of doing, which is limiting itself or negating in any way. Um, it's axiomatic within the Thomistic metaphysics that act or being is not self-limiting. Um, this is more or less within Thomistic philosophy conceived to be the case, because if act limited itself, we would be saying non-being of absolute being, and this is conceived as inconsistent and as unthinkable. So the what it is that contributes this function that being is incapable of providing in its pureness and by itself is something that is meant to be an otherwise than being, of which being is said. So within entities, um, entities that would not be pure being alone in itself subsistently, God for Aquinas, um, within entities otherwise than God, um, that which distinguishes, that which provides for plurality within the entity, is this otherwise than pure being, which is otherwise called essence. So this is why it is that in Thomistic philosophy, it is widely held that the function of essence is to, in its receiving being, to limit being. This can be seen in a variety of post after Aquinas's death, a variety of scholastic thinkers who expounded on his work. Perhaps most clearly, Domingo Banez, a couple hundred years after Aquinas. Banez argues that this is precisely the function of essences, to limit. The contemporary Thomistic debate between thick essence and thin essence, one could see proponents of the thin essence view being Carlo or maybe Norris Clark at certain junctures. The proponents of the thin essence view hold that the only function of essence is to limit. The proponents of the thick essence view argue that there's a further ontological density or positivity to essence beyond its function of simple limitation, So that when pure being is said relative to essence, it certainly the essence in receiving being certainly does limit, but it also contributes something further. Um, for more on that debate, see the ultimate reducibility of essence to existence in existential metaphysics by Carlo. Um, for our purposes, we'll be able to say that it is at least the case that the function of essence in the Thomistic metaphysics is to limit. No one denies that this is what essence does for being. Whether it does something further through this limit or not is for further debate, really exegetically within Aquinas. Um, for my for my own opinion here, we can say, for the purposes of the pure exposition of analogy, what distinguishes the otherwise than being from pure being, um, why it is it was posited as a principle at all, was in order to account for what it is that being was alone and in itself conceived as incapable of achieving, which is negation or limit. So I believe that for our purposes, it's appropriate for us to say that essence is essentially comprised with the limitation of being, such that in the analogy of being, when being is said in a proportional or relative way, that it is said relative to a principle, the essential function of which is limitation or negation. So, with this background, we have the resources to return to Deleuze's text and start to see why it is that he would claim this essential feature of analogy, which is to account for the differences within being in terms of something that limits pure being. Why it is that this would be incapable of accounting for individuation. Um, if we consider for a moment, before returning to Deleuze's text, if we consider for a moment the reasons for um, this presentation of analogy, um, the ostensive impotence of the resources of analogy to account for individuation will become clearer. Um, the reason why we required the positing and otherwise than being, the function of which was to limit being, um, is because of two things, one of which is a principle and the other of which is a fact. The fact is multiplicity in being. The principle is that of transcendental philosophy within scholasticism, which is that being is convertible with unity, where unity has the intention of indivision. So what this requires then is that if we are to have multiplicity within being, where being is conceived of as indivision or as indivisible alone and in itself, then what is required is that there be principles that are relative non-being or relatively external to being, um, uh, analogous to which being is said, the function of which is to contribute what being alone and in itself was ostensibly incapable of achieving. Um, if being was not convertible with unity, we would not require further principles to account for multiplicity, because being alone and in itself would be immediately applicable to, it would immediately through itself be multiplicity of some sort. Um, and but this is precisely what it is that is denied throughout scholasticism, as we'll see further. Um, What this also means, this reason why we had to posit analogy, this transcendental convertibility of being and unity, means that that to which being is said in a relative sense must also be convertible with unity. So the forms of essence which limit and relativize being must be um, must be articulations of the forms of identity, or must be in themselves forms of some kind of unity. If we consider the various different kinds of unity that are posited throughout scholasticism, we can see clearly we have numerical unity that is granted by almost everyone, probably not Eriugena, but almost everybody else. Um, we have formal unity as it's found in Duns Scotus. Um, we have a whole variety of different approaches to all different kinds of unity. We might be able to fairly say that these different kinds of unity are groupable into two different sorts that we are familiar with from the Aristotelian syllogistic logic, which is we have the uh, general terms and we have singular terms, um, where the general in some sense is applicable to applicable in principle to some variety, and the singular is applicable to only one. So that the we're then able to say a classic syllogism. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Socrates is mortal. The universal and particular terms that subsume the individual term. And this seems to be, at least as it's understood within scholasticism, the exhaustive articulation of the forms of unity, the forms of identity, which is in terms of what is in itself general and what is in itself already particular. So now we can ask if this is that to which being is said relatively, whether it is that the forms of generality are capable of saying, are allow us to be able to say what the individuality of the individual consists in, and further, whether it is that saying being relatively to the already particular allows us the ability to say what the individuality of the individual consists in, which is what Deleuze's said analogy cannot do. So if we turn, we've gone from now page 38 to 235. Deleuze says that he's talking about when the negative emerges in being. And this is his third treatment of the negative in difference and repetition. He says negation is the inverted image of difference. In other words, the image of intensity seen from below. And he says that the negative appears only with extensity and quality. So we should tie this in with what we've said initially, which is that the analogy of being essentially requires saying being relatively to something which would serve as a negative, which would negate or limit being. So what Deleuze is saying here is that what it is that negates, or where the negative emerges, is in quality and extensity. So what Deleuze is saying is that the way that he understands the domain of essence for Aquinas is that it's reducible to quality and extensity. So we might want to say, okay, if we have quality and extensity, it seems as though we're able to account for the individuality of individual beings through the resources of quality and extensity. If we go to page 247, we find Deleuze's critique of this notion, though. He says, the individual is neither a quality nor an extension. The individual is neither a qualification nor a partition, neither an organization nor a determination of species. The individual is no more an infima species than it is composed of parts. And then he says, qualitative or extensive interpretations of individuation remain incapable of providing reasons why a quality ceases to be general or why a synthesis of extensity begins here and finishes there. So, what Deleuze is saying when he says these these forms of the negative, which is to say the entire domain of essence as he understands it, according to the analysis we've given regarding analogy, uh, these forms of the negative, these forms of identity, in fact, remain general. And if they remain general, then they are incapable of accounting for the individuality of the individual being. So if we say, what is it that constitutes the individuality of an individual entity, and we posit as the answer to this something that in itself is general or common, then we of course have not accounted for the actual individuality of this instance. This principle, that what it is that in itself is common is incapable of accounting for what in itself is individual, as the contrary to what is common, is a is itself a common feature of accounts of individuation within scholasticism. Um, so this is hardly problematic as a principle for what will be able to account for individuation and what will not. What is revolutionary in this, though, is that Deleuze is saying that all of the forms, it seems as though all of the forms of identity um, to which being would be said in a relative way with an analogy that in themselves are general would be incapable of accounting for the individuality of the individual. So this provides, on its face, a fundamental critique of the analogy of being, in as much as the analogy of being would require an explanation of the being of individuals, which we'll get into in a little bit. Um, but one might want to say, in light of this, um, wait, we have no intention of describing the individuality of an individual in terms of what is common. Um, as mentioned before, this is a common principle within scholastic debates on individuation. That, of course, this doesn't provide a good account. Um, what we should do instead is say being um, relative to something that is particular or something that is not otherwise than general, something that is in itself singular. And when being is said, being is limited to the particular or to the singular. In this instance, we then have a way in which analogy is able to say um, what constitutes the individuality of individual beings. Um, and on its face, this looks as though it is a response to Deleuze. Because, as we said in both of the quotes initially on page 38 and on page 303, the for or the because, the explanation that Deleuze offers for why it is that analogy is incapable of accounting for individuality is because he says all of the work is done between generic and specific differences, which seems as though that only applies to the domain of things that are in themselves common, the forms of essence as some kind of generality that's already been critiqued. So it looks as though a response might be able to be offered in terms of saying, well, what about what it is that in itself is not general, rather what it is that in itself is particular. Um, might want to note in this circumstance that a Thomistic, for instance, account of individuation in terms of signate matter with dimensive quantity would be precisely this kind of account of individuation. Really, what we're trying to do is to account, first of all, for the individuation of substances, and then by trying to account for the individuation of substances, we appeal to an internal principle of material substances, and we say this is what it is that is primitively individual within material substances, which would be um, uh, matter under dimensive quantity or whatever. Um, this is further a feature of Duns Scotus's account of individuation, where in question uh, in his Ordinatio, he deals with the problem of individuation in yes, in Ordinatio 2, distinction 3, part 1, questions 1 through 6. And in question, in the middle of, I believe, question 5, no, yes, in the middle of question 6, he provides his own account of individuation in terms of what his followers will call the hexaity, but he himself calls the individual entity or the individual difference. And what characterizes this uh, is that it's primarily diverse. It's already of itself individual. All of the diverse beings and their differences are reduced to what it is that is primarily diverse, otherwise than the nature of the individual. The sexaity is the individual entity, um, and so is in and of itself already individual. So this is a common theme as an account for individuation within scholasticism. So why is it that this side of a potential approach to the analogy of being that Scotus doesn't hold? He has a very distinctive way of accounting for the way that the primarily diverse as ultimate differences appear within univocal being. Um, but one way or another, the way that the analogy of being, or the way that a scholastic philosophy might account for individuation in terms of what is primitively individual, why would this not work? And it's here we can find another aspect of Deleuze's overall criticism throughout difference and repetition, and can perhaps point to it as why it is that he takes this to be an inappropriate understanding of individuality, or perhaps not a resolution of the problem at all. So he says when he's treating in the extended introduction, repetition, and difference of the notion of a bare repetition, and how it is that it is actually just the expression of a more fundamental clothed repetition, or a horizontal repetition that is the expression or real product of a vertical repetition. What he says on page 15 is that this plurality, really this numerical plurality underneath a common or same identity, um, uh, is attributed to elements which are really distinct, but nevertheless share the same concept. Repetition thus appears as a difference, but a difference absolutely without concept. In this sense, it's an indifferent difference. This seems to be what is meant when we're talking about the primarily diverse, what it is that's in itself individual, that is that by which the lowest concept, the infamous species, is pluralized. This is, in a sense, how it is that Porphyry in the Isagoge understands the realm of individuals that he takes Plato to say, we can't go there with science. We can't go there. Let's leave the realm of individuals alone, and just go as far as the infamous species will take us. This Deleuze says So he says of this, as long as we invoke absolute conceptual identity for distinct objects, we suggest a purely negative explanation, which he qualifies then to say an explanation by default. So this is very important. Why it is that when he says that this is an explanation by default, this the primarily diverse as as an account for the pluralization of the concept into numerically distinct individuals. Um, it's an explanation by default because it seems as though it has poured everything that we wanted to explain, which is individuality and numerical distinction as such, into a particular aspect of, or a particular ontological principle or element of entities. And then by way of taking on this element, um, through whether it be, matter, form, potentiality, actuality, unum per se sort of business, or whatever, when this element becomes a real part of a substance, for instance, the substance then is participates in or exercises perhaps this primitive individuality, this primitive singleness that was already there in latently in the matter, latently in the hexaity, etc. Um, and this doesn't seem as though it's actually accounted for, as Deleuze said, being able to say what the individuality of the individual consists in. On page 221, he says something very similar, and he actually explicitly draws out, or 271 rather. 271, he says something very similar, and he actually explicitly draws out, he explicitly calls out matter as what it is that functions as this negative explanation. He says, within representation, the forces which ensure repetition, in other words, the multiplicity of things for a concept absolutely the same, can only be negatively determined. So there's no real positive determination, which is an actual saying of what it is that constitutes the individuality of the individual within representation, which he claims is intimately tied to the analogy of being or an analogous metaphysics. And he calls out matter and says, uh, matter realizes this state of the concept outside itself, or the infinitely repeated element. Um, so he chastises any attempt to point to matter as something that is primitively the concept outside itself, primitively repeated or repeatable, um, that would then give an account of the real repetition or the real numerical diversity of entities. So it seems as though in this we have an impasse because we were forced to say being relative to essence, in as much as there was to be plurality, and essence was meant to provide us with the internal principle of finite being by which it is multiplied numerically. And yet, we're also forced to say that essence is that to which we say being relatively is when being is said of this, it's convertible with unity. And so this essence must have the forms of unity. But the forms of unity were exhaustively determined into what it is that's in itself general and what it is that's in itself particular. And yet, if it was what it is that, if the individuality of the individual was we tried to account for this in terms of what was in itself general, we would find ourselves unable to provide an explanation of that individuality. And if we said that that to which being was said relatively in the essence was in itself particular, matter or the hexaity or whatever, then it seems as though, again, we're incapable of saying what the individuality of the individual consists in. Rather, we've presupposed the answer, localized it within a particular part of finite entity, and then said that that it's exercised by the entire entity when it becomes a real element. So Deleuze's criticism here that he lays out on page 38, um, the criticism of the analogy of being, is tied to two further elements of his criticism of bare repetition on the one hand, and his criticism of the negative and the forms of the negative to be able to give an account of individuated being on the other hand. So there is an incredible unity within difference and repetition, but in order to discover this unity, um, the sources that he's dealing with, such as this eidetic deduction of what is required within the analogy of being, has to first be worked out, so we understand that the analogy of being is essentially related to the negative. Um, Elsewise, the criticism looks like a mere assertion and not an argument. Um, Next, we will consider what Deleuze's positive account of individuation in fact will be, and how it is that this explicitly departs from the various elements of this scholastic tradition. We're back. So, brief recap. Deleuze has, we've shown that Deleuze has argued against the analogical understanding of being precisely because he believes it's incapable of saying that which constitutes the individuality of individual entities. So there are a couple things that we're going to want to say here. One of them is why it is that we should care whether it is that our understanding of being is allows us to be able to say what the individuality of individual entities consists of. Because one could perhaps respond to this criticism by saying, yes, and I don't care. But this is, I don't think, an option available to the Thomist or the Aristotelian, who would be primarily those who would argue vehemently for an analogical understanding of being in the first place. Why is this? Because I take it as, and I believe that Deleuze takes it this way too, that what is phenomenologically basic in our experience is that which is given through sensation. Deleuze understands the transcendental usage of sensibility has as its object, such as it is, to be intensity, which, as we'll see in a moment, has a special relationship to individuality. And further, both in Aquinas and in Aristotle, the object of the senses is the singular. The object of the understanding is the universal, or the element, perhaps, of the understanding is the universal. So, what's absolutely prior, that which initially manifests being to us, is that which is given in the senses. In, which is to say, individual entities. So we would expect that a realist metaphysic that is empirically informed, which would be both the aim of a Thomistic noetic and epistemology, or a Thomistic noetic epistemology and ontology, as well as a Deleuzian noetic, such as it is, and metaphysic, is to provide a theoretical understanding of the individuals that actually manifest being to us uh, most proximally, in what it is that seems to be most proper to them, which is their very individuality or their very singularity. Um, Being incapable of providing such an account, being straitjacketed by our understanding of being, if this is in fact what has occurred, would leave us um, in a position of not being able to return back or recur back upon with our theorizing um, the real world that we encounter and experience. This is, I think, what Deleuze means when he repeatedly says in Difference and Repetition that his aim is to provide the conditions for real experience rather than possible experience, which is to say, in our real experience, what we encounter are a plurality of individuals. To provide an account for our real experience is the aim of his transcendental empiricism, that he calls it, which is precisely to think in the element wherein individuals are constituted in their very individuality, so as to allow us to theoretically enter into intercourse with individuals in a way that perhaps previous philosophy has been unable to do. Deleuze, on several occasions, refers to what is wrong with a philosophy of the categories of possible experience, a la Kant, um, is that the net that it hopes to cast over reality is too large, and he claims the largest fish pass through, which is to say, the concrete, the real, the noumenal is precisely what it is that is incapable of being encapsulated, incapable of being understood in terms of understood adequately at all in terms of uh, the concepts utilized by representation. And so, if we are to say anything of the noumenal at all, and not just what it is that we discover that we've placed into entities, what we require is perhaps a revolution in the kinds of concepts that we utilize. So this is what is at the root of Deleuze's aim in Difference and Repetition, is to say the noumenal in a way that is adequate to it, which precisely means to say the individual in a way that is adequate to it. Um, and so, from what we've said before, to perhaps to break with analogy. Um, so now that we've said this is what his aim is and why it is that it might be important for the aims of a realist ontology and noetic, um, we might want to say a little bit about what um, what exactly um, this solution looks like relative to the many scholastic solutions regarding individuation that were proffered over the long history of scholasticism. And as opposed to reciting the variety of the actual solutions that were proffered, it's helpful to perhaps look at one particular solution to the problem of individuation that was, by consensus and universally excluded from thematic consideration within the history of the scholastic debates regarding individuation. Um, this is precisely to quote from the excellent um, excellent work, Individuation and Scholasticism and the Later Middle Ages, edited by Gracia. Um, we can say that in Alan B. Walter's essay on SCOTUS, he treats of one of the various prior possible attempts at individuation that SCOTUS considers, um, and see whether it is that this attempt actually had any adherence, which is the existential theory of individuation. Um, Walter says uh, the editors suggest that there might have been one Franciscan master named Peter DeFalco, um, who was a proponent of the existential theory of individuation. Um, but the editors that Paul Vincent Spade, in his translation of Scotus's works, the editors that he refers to, Spade claims were unable to find any adherence to the existential theory of individuation within scholasticism. Um, Further, it's telling that Scotus, when he treats of the existential theory of individuation, does not himself refer to any thinkers who actually did hold to this in the past. Whereas usually he's quite uh, uh, he goes into a good deal of detail as to who it is who has held the belief that he criticizes. Usually Henry of Ghent. Um, Further, we can say that Gracia, in his wonderful work Individuality, an essay on the foundations of metaphysics, has further said that existence is never in all of the Middle Ages considered to be a principle of individuation. Further, for a last quote, we can say that Peter King's essay, The Problem of Individuation in the Middle Ages, when he deals with existential individuation, he says again that there is no one within all of scholasticism who holds to an existential theory of individuation. So this is an incredibly interesting negative consensus within the long history of scholasticism that, contrary to popular opinion, is actually characterized by extremely heterogeneous and varied views on almost every subject. So it's very unique that that there would be certain elements of commonality like this, such as that existence or pure being would not ever be able to be the principle of individuation. So it's worth noting perhaps why that's the case in order to see in order to then see whether it is that Deleuze's assumptions would run contra to the assumptions of scholasticism on this point, and then further to say, as I intend to say, that Deleuze's theory of individuation can be understood as an existential theory of individuation. So the reasons why I think we can point to in two works. One of them is Suarez's Metaphysical Disputation 5 on individuation. And in chapter or section 5, rather, he asks whether the existence of the singular thing is the principle of individuation. And he says no. He'll end up going on to hold a view that is related but importantly distinguished, because it will actually be real essence. The real essence of the individual is, or the real essence of the entity will be its principle of individuation. But this is slightly distinguished, of course, from existence or being alone otherwise than essence as the principle of individuation. So he says mainly that this contraction and subordination is not caused by of individuality, is not caused by actual existence, which comes contingently to the fully constituted individuated essence. So we have the priority of whatever it is that individuates everything that limits and contracts within the order of essence, and then existence, or that by which it is, then comes upon in an almost accidental sense, as Avicenna would perhaps say, that this comes upon in an accidental sense an already individuated essence. So all of the work of individuality has actually already been done at the level of essence rather than contributed at all by way of existence. And further, Suarez continues, he says, in existence itself, there can be considered the common notion of human existence, for example, and the notion of this existence of Peter and Paul. So, because existence ranges over both the individual and the common, we can then ask, therefore, concerning existence itself, it remains to be asked what makes it a this. So it seems as though something further beyond existence or pure being itself is required in order to account for its being a this. Um, we continue, if you say that it, i.e., existence, is made a this by itself, why do you not say it with more reason concerning the essence? Since the essence is both prior in the order of nature and also in perfection, and since it is in a way more absolute. For existence is the act of this essence. Hence, this existence will be a this rather because it actualizes this essence. So, what Suarez points to is to say that, as we saw when we were talking about the analogy of being, something outside of being, essence, was required in order to account for the limitation or even the contraction of being. And pure being alone, raw existence, was incapable of accounting for its own limitation or its own contraction to the individual. Um, Further, Scotus, when he deals with this same point, in question three of his discussion about individuation, he says that the being of existence, the esse existentia, does not have its own differences other than the differences of the being of essence. Again, we see the same point that's made by Suarez, which is that the being of existence, or esse alone, is incapable of accounting for its own limitation or its own contraction, and that it requires external principles that are that which gives the limitation, that which gives the contraction. Rather, the being of existence is precisely determined from something else's determination. Same point. So we can ask, he says, furthermore, there is the same question about existence as there is about the nature, which he dealt with in question 1. By what and from where is it contracted so that it is a this? Going on a little bit, because it is not a this of itself. So because existence, or pure being alone, is not a this of itself, and does not have its own differences, it cannot be the sufficient reason for its contraction, is the claim. And so requires principles external to it that contract or individuate individuate pure existence. So we might want to ask why it is that this is the case, and this will allow us back into the junction of Deleuze's distinctive understanding of being and its relationship to difference and repetition, which is, if we consider one more consensus within scholastic philosophy, we can actually see how it is that we're able to account for the negative consensus that existence cannot be the principle of individuation. If we look at the wonderful work, Medieval Philosophy as Transcendental Thought by Jan Ertzen, we can see that although there is an enormous degree of variety within transcendental thought in scholasticism, from Philip the Chancellor in 1225 to Francisco Suarez toward the end of the 16th century, there's an enormous degree of variation in the various ways that they understand um, the what the transcendental properties of being would be. So that which being is convertible with, what the nature of the transcendentals are. So how it is that they are distinguished from being as opposed to being entirely synonymous and so superfluous. So transcendental thought in medieval times was a hotly debated, and there was really not a lot of areas of consensus, uh, even down to the number of the transcendental properties of being. Some some, like Philip the Chancellor, as mentioned, would not recognize what later proponents of the transcendentals would recognize, such as res, thing, or aluid, something, as transcendentals that would be recognized by Avicenna or by Aquinas or Henry of Ghent, but would not be recognized by Philip the Chancellor, for instance. So it is, but despite all of this variation, there is in fact one very distinctive agreement amongst all of the scholastics who dealt with the transcendental properties of being, which is really most of the great names that we know, um, which is that um, being is convertible with unity. And in fact, this is for most thinkers, um, I think, with perhaps one exception, unity is the very first transcendental property of being. So it is universally held within medieval thought that unity is that being is convertible with unity, and further, it is universally held within medieval thought that the intention of unity, which is indivision. So precisely when we have being, we have indivision, and this was held by uh, all players in the metaphysics of the medieval age. And this allows us to say, perhaps, why it is that there was not an existential theory of individuation within medieval philosophy. Um, Pure existence or being alone would, by itself, be convertible with unity, which is in division. So, how it is that division would then enter into being would then of necessity be by way of something otherwise than being alone and in itself, which is precisely to say, as we said a moment ago, that the analogy of being is closely linked, is a an essential element of much medieval metaphysics, and now we can understand why, because it's related to the transcendental convertibility of being and unity, and this is precisely why it is that an existential theory of individuation, or that being alone would be sufficient for the explanation of individuality and individuation, is not thematically pursued within scholastic philosophy. Um, so it's with this background that we're then able to say, okay, so why is it that this relates to Deleuze? So I want to start off with a quote from Daniel W. Smith in his essay on the doctrine of univocity in Deleuze, from the volume on Deleuze and religion. So page 177 of that volume. Um, he says that Deleuze's thesis in difference and repetition is that only univocity can provide us with a truly collective sense of being, and not merely a distributive sense. And it does this, I say, by giving us a comprehension of the play of individuating differences within beings, and not mere generalities in a network of resemblances. Um, so, what this, what Daniel W. Smith is saying is precisely that the univocity of being, as Deleuze understands it, is intimately related to an attempt at saying being immediately and without a diminution of individuating difference. And this, in fact, comes from the text of Deleuze, as we can see as he elaborates upon the what is contrary to the analogical understanding of being that he criticizes on page 38. He continues with what is distinctive of the univocal understanding of being as he understands it. So, by contrast to the analogical understanding of being, when we say that univocal being is related immediately and essentially to individuating factors, we certainly do not mean by the latter individuals constituted an experience. If being was immediately related to individuals constituted within experience, it seems as though we would have there would be no collective sense of being. Being would actually be said in a purely equivocal way of all already constituted individuals, and so in fact we would have something very akin to perhaps a nominalism, which I do not believe is Deleuze's aim here. Um, so it's not said of immediately of individuals constituted an experience, but rather that which acts in them as a transcendental principle, as a plastic, anarchic, and nomadic principle, contemporaneous with the process of individuation, no less capable of dissolving and destroying individuals than of constituting them temporarily. Intrinsic modalities of being, passing from one individual to another, circulating and communicating beneath matters and forms. The individuating is not the simple individual. And it's precisely this, what it is that is individuating, or this process of individuation, that Deleuze wants to say a being is said immediately of this process of individuation, um, which on its face seems to be precisely what was denied within scholasticism, that being be said immediately of that which constitutes individuals, as principle of individuation. So if we continue on here, we can say univocity of being, insofar as it is immediately related to difference, demands that we show how individuating difference precedes generic, specific, and even individual differences within being, how a prior field of individuation within being conditions at once the determination of species, of forms, the determination of parts, and their individual variations. If individuation does not take place either by form, when we say being relatively to the forms of generality, or by matter, when we say it when we say being analogically or relatively to the forms of identity, in as much as they're already particular, neither qualitatively on the one hand nor extensionally on the other. This is not only because it differs in kind, but because it is already presupposed by forms, matters, and extensive parts. Um, so what he claims that we're trying to go for on page 39 is the universal being is to be said of the most singular, independently of any mediation. We're meaning to say being immediately of Paul Patton translates it as individual differences, but that's actually an error. It's immediately of individuating differences is what is said in the French. So saying being immediately of individuating differences is coextensive with the way that Deleuze understands what is meant by his own understanding of the univocity of being. So now that we've juxtaposed what Deleuze is aiming for with this negative consensus within scholasticism, we can easily see what it is that he denies, that scholastics universally affirmed. which is precisely that being alone and in itself is one. So, if we note here, and we'll pull out a piece from Difference and Repetition on this in a moment. But first, if we note here the background of Deleuze's account of individuation, this particular commitment will become more clear. Um, Deleuze writes a review of Gilbert Simondon's individuation and its physico-biological genesis um, in 1966. So 2 years before the publication of Difference and Repetition. And what he says is distinctive of Simondon's approach to individuation, his idiosyncratic approach to individuation, is precisely that is precisely this. What Simondon elaborates is an entire ontology, one in which being is never one. As pre-individual, it is a metastable more than one, superimposed and simultaneous to itself. As individuated, it is again multiple because it is multiphasic. It is a phase of becoming that will lead to new operations, he quotes Simondon. And if we again consider the introduction to what has been published now in French as the individuation in light of form and information, which is the 2-volume work of Simondon's doctoral thesis, the first part of which is what Deleuze was reviewing in 1966, we can say what the way Simondon understands being and its relation to individuation is as something that is above the level of unity, more than unity, and more than identity. That's the way he understands what being is, in as much as it's able to account for individuation. It's not this pre-individual, as we'll say, is neither is not subjugated to the forms of identity. To quote from Simondon, he says, "Unity and identity only apply to one of the phases of being, posterior to the operation of individuation. These notions cannot help us to discover the principle of individuation. They do not apply to ontogenesis understood in its fullest sense. That is to say, the becoming of being as a being that divides and dephases itself by individuating itself." So, what Deleuze is picking out from Simondon is precisely this understanding of being alone and in itself, that that of what it is a becoming, is a multiplicity. What we're able to see this clearly when Deleuze, and so as a multiplicity is not a one, is the punchline. What Deleuze says on page 40 of Difference and Repetition is illuminating in this regard. So, in order to have a univocal understanding of being that doesn't collapse into Spinoza's substance, for instance, where the substance is still in some sense ontologically prior to the modes, what he says is that what we have to do is to have substance. Substance must be said of the modes and only of the modes, which mirrors the same sentiment on page 304 in his famous conclusion of Difference and Repetition. Such a condition can be satisfied only at the price of a more general categorical reversal, according to which being is said of becoming, identity of that which is different, the one of the multiple, etc. That identity, which is unity, not be first, that it exists as a principle, but as a second principle, as a principle become that revolve around the different. Such would be the nature of a Copernican revolution, which opens up the possibility of difference having its own concept, rather than being maintained under the domination of a concept in general already understood as identical. So what Deleuze's aim, which is precisely to provide this absolute understanding of difference, as opposed to a relative difference between already constituted identities, um, as he lays out at the beginning of his work, is intimately related to precisely this break with the understanding of unity as or as being as convertible with unity, which is also the reason why it is that an existential understanding of individuation was considered to be impossible within scholastic thought. Um, it also helps us this consensus that unity is one of the things that being can be converted with. Um, uh, this commonality within scholastic thought also helps us to explain why it is that there would be a principle within Thomas's thought, for instance, that being is not self-limiting. Um, Whipple says in his work, The Metaphysical Thought of Thomas Aquinas, that this is axiomatic and that there is no derivation of this principle that would seem to found the reason why there can't be existential individuation within Thomas's works. We might be able to say that the reason for that is because of this what appears to be self-evident commitment to uh, being's convertibility with unity, which is precisely the commitment that Deleuze is so intent upon overturning. And what this means is that for those who follow the Thomistic metaphysic, um, uh, appeal to this principle will be insufficient to uh, to overturn the Deleuzian critique, which forces neo-scholastics perhaps to dive deeper into our understanding of being on account of Deleuze's criticisms. Um, so with this understood, I want to outline a little bit what Deleuze's understanding of how being individuates, um, uh, what precisely that is, because it can perhaps be seen as a lot of big talk to criticize one of the greatest metaphysicians uh, of the West, Thomas Aquinas, and via him, Plato and the Sophist, who arguably is the greatest metaphysician of the West, um, without being able to provide positively for an alternative, merely asserting almost petulantly that difference must have its own principle and that it somehow is obscurely related to an account of individuation without being able to provide a positive account is maybe a tempting way for the critics of Deleuze to read him. So I want to outline what I take to be his own positive understanding of individuation, and I want to go about this in a rather idiosyncratic way, because there's already been a lot of really good literature on Deleuze's understanding of individuation that I'll refer to right now, and I want to explain what it is that I think is occurring in this literature, and then perhaps describe what I think this account will be able to do otherwise. One of the one of the great one particularly useful essay on this is Individual Existence and the Philosophy of Difference by Robert Stern in the Oxford Handbook of Continental Philosophy. The latter half of it provides a really good description of Deleuze's understanding of individuation in contrast to the way Stern interprets Hegel's understanding of individuation in terms of the concrete universal. Another one is A New Individuation, Deleuze's Simondon Connection by Andrew Iliadis, which is, again, really helpful in understanding how Deleuze picks up on Simondon's understanding of individuation. Differences in Becoming, Gilbert Simondon and Gilles Deleuze on Individuation by Emmanuel Aloa and Judith Michelet. is again really helpful for understanding the relationships between Simondon and Deleuze on individuation, and some of the particular biological metaphors that Deleuze uses to explain what's going on in particularly physico-biological genesis, in line with Simondon's title. Uh, and the last essay that I'm familiar with in English on Deleuze's account of individuation is called "Monstrous Individuations: Deleuze, Simondon, and Relational Ontology," which helps to describe again Deleuze's account of individuation in relation to Simondon. Um, so what I think that these various sources do quite well is to describe how it is that we might have, um, and how it is that Deleuze might be able to account for um, uh, an identity, um, perhaps through time, or some kind of synthesis within perception, or some kind of unit that is already numerically distinct from other units and brings in various elements. Um, and how using particularly physical, uh, biological, thermodynamic examples, how it is that this occurs, and so unites Deleuze with a broader understanding of um, perhaps individuation informed by the sciences and whatnot. Um, but what I think tends to be the case in these various accounts is that we've supposed one particular understanding of individuation um, at the onset, and have explained how it is that Deleuze gives an account in terms of the virtual and the actual and whatnot of this. Um, but I think that there is perhaps a deeper question as to why it is that Deleuze thinks his ontology of difference is dealing with the domain of individuality itself, before it is that we then say that Deleuze's ontology of difference is able to, in fact, and account for in the actual the plurality of numerically distinct, qualitatively varied individuals. Um, so I think that we can give a twofold account. But first of all, I want to say a little something about why it is that the account of why it is that Deleuze is dealing with the element of individuality is prior to um, the question of the of individual differences between beings. So again, I'm going to refer to Gracia on his book Individuality, where he opens up with a very helpful set of distinctions in different ways that the intention of individuality has been taken within the history of philosophy. He lists 6 different ways that that the intention of individuality, which is, you might say, uh, that which qualifies something an individual. Um, the different ways that individuality has been understood. He says that one of these ways is to understand individuality as identity. Another is to understand individuality as division. Another is to understand individuality as difference, um, as in division or atomaticity, and as a being a subject of predicates. These are 5 that he takes to be deficient understandings of individuality in terms of providing necessary and sufficient conditions for an individual. And I tend to agree. And here's why. What is meant by identity as the intention of individuality is to say, well, if we have there is socriety as the identity of the individual Socrates. And so, what is it that accounts for, or is the individuality of Socrates? It is this identity of sobriety. And yet it seems that that individuality is, as we've said, or that identity, as we've said beforehand, also has general terms. We're able to say there's a formal identity which can be had in common between a variety of numerically distinct individuals, and so it doesn't seem as though um, identity alone is able to account for the fullness of what is meant by individuality. Similarly, division, which is to say the division of a lowest species, or having a plurality of individuals underneath a common species, which is the way that, as I mentioned before, Porphyry understands identity, also doesn't seem to fully account for what is involved with individuality. Um, I Why is it that this would be everything that is meant by individuality? It seems as though this is what follows upon individuality. It's hardly what is characteristic of the individuals as such. We might be able to say that there could be one instance, for instance, uh, and so we wouldn't have a division into multiple numerically distinct entities underneath a lowest species. And yet, there would not be any reason why we would say that just because by some accident, if there were only two individuals, one of them was annihilated, that the other one would no longer be individual. Similarly, difference in the sense of external difference hardly seems to account for what is involved in individuality, because difference is a relative term when conceived of in this way, and so the difference between this and this doesn't seem to account for the individuality of either side. In fact, it seems to presuppose whatever it is that has made them numerically singular. We can probably point to Scotus's criticisms of Henry of Ghent's negative account of individuation here, which is to say, what makes the negatives individual? It seems like this is again difference is after the fact. So numerical difference is secondary upon something else. Um, Similarly, in division, uh, the atom, in Greek, which means the alpha privative of Timaeus, which is division. Um, again, doesn't seem to be all that's meant by individuality, because there are in fact entities within our experience, a whole variety of them, that in fact are capable of real division into their integral parts, and there's no problem with that. An apple remains just as individual once we have cut it into 8 pieces. Each of the pieces is also individual. So individuality doesn't consist in the incapability of being divided. Um, and finally, individuality seems to be an ontological term and not a logical term. And so just the mere fact of only occurring in the subject position rather than the predicate position, the fifth option that Gracia points to as being part of Boethius's understanding of individuality, and you might be able to say in Aristotle as well, in the categories. This again hardly seems to account for whatever is ontologically distinctive in the individual that is its individuality, as opposed to a logical feature. So Gracia puts forward what I take to be, and we'll prove in a moment, what I take to be the distinctive way that Deleuze, or the distinctive way that we would understand individuality otherwise, and what I think will be the way that Deleuze understands individuality, which is in terms of non-instantiability. So if we have general terms, what is characteristic of these general terms is the capacity to be instantiated, or perhaps the capacity to be participated in. What is distinctive of um, what is distinctive of singular terms seems to be that they cannot be participated in. It would be a category mistake to say that Socrates is participated in by something further. If this was the case, we wouldn't have Socrates anymore. We would have an abstract, general term that is capable of instantiation. And as capable of instantiation, capable of multiple instantiation, although the multiple is not necessary for this. Um, So non-instantiability, uh, Gracia argues, is what is characteristic of individuality. But Gracia stops there. Gracia says that instantiability, non-instantiability, these are primitive terms. They're incapable of analysis. Um, and so he says we have different modes of being. We have instantiable modes of being. We have non-instantiable modes of being. The individual ones are the non-instantiable ones. Um, but I think that there's a way that we can give an analysis of non-instantiability and then can um, locate the terms of this analysis in Deleuze's definition of individuality in two places in difference and repetition. Um, First of all, we have to note something in the eidetic structure of instantiation as such, or in participation as such. I think the clearest place where this element of instantiation um, is drawn out is in Proclus's Elements of Theology, in Propositions 2 and Propositions 18. In Propositions 2 and 18, what Proclus argues for is that which follows upon something, in the sense of participating in the something, is always less than, ontologically less than, that which is participated in or that which is instantiable. And the proof for this is interesting. The proof in Proposition 18 is to say that if the that which follows upon, or that which instantiates, was not ontologically less or degraded or declined, then then we would have the exact same entity on both sides of the participation relation, which is contra to what is involved in the participation relation, period. So Proclus argues in the Elements of Theology that the notion of participation involves formal identity between the participatable and the participant, and yet that the participant, just qua participant, is lesser in degree, not as regards the formality, but lesser in degree as regards the way that it has this formality, or as regards its entity, as we might say later. Uh, this is again consistent with with the way that Deleuze understands what participation is. In his essay on the simulacrum and ancient philosophy in the Logic of Sense, he says on page 255 that to participate is at best to rank second. So this is precisely the same concept. This notion of ranking, this notion of a degree of possession, and it's not accidental that this would be the case. When we consider what it is that is to be participated in itself, alone in itself, what we have is something that is purely self-identical. It's self in itself, the famous Platonic phrase, and the famous Platonic phrase is characteristic of all of Neoplatonism, all talk of participation or instantiation from there on forward. The sense in which it would be perfectly itself is then to say anything that's not perfectly just itself, which is to say takes part in or has this second, which is an instantiation, will necessarily fall away from the perfect self-consistency, self-identity of that which is participatable. So this element of a diminution in the way in which there is a possession of whatever the formality in play is that is instantiated is essential to the notion of participation or instantiation. So this is, and it's important that we then recognize degrees to which something that is formally identical is possessed is exactly what is meant by degrees of intensity. This is going to be what is characteristic within Deleuze's philosophy, is an inversion of the understanding of intensity Um, I but it's important to recognize that then what is essentially involved in any instantiation is a diminution in intensity while necessarily maintaining the self identity of the form in the participant. So this will then allow us to say on page 221, um, page 221 of Difference in Repetition, Deleuze opens up the very first the very first perhaps definition of the individual or of individuality as it appears in his work, and it's interesting why it is that this would be it's interesting how characteristically different this is from uh, from what it is that we've seen before. So he says, uh, is it not beneath the species and the parts, the qualities and numbers, the most intense or most individual act? So what we have involved here when he says whatever this is, what this is it's the its intensity as that which grounds dramatization. He says it's the most intense or the most individual act. So what we should recognize is that this or in the middle here is not an exclusive or. This isn't the or of saying it's either intense or it is individual. Rather, it's amplative. When he says the most intense, he then says, as in individual act is perhaps another way to interpret what's going on here. So what this means is that Deleuze has understood uh, individuality to be essentially related to the notion of intensity in some sense. So we might ask why that's the case, why it is that individuality and intensity are related in Deleuze, and then why it is that this would be associated with the notion of non-instantiability. And the account is actually very very interesting. What he will say here when I find it on page 254, he goes on to describe what about this intensity relates it to the notion of individuality, which is 254. The indivisibility of the individual pertains solely to the property of intensive quantities, not to divide without changing nature. So this is this notion of the indivisibility of the individual. We'll be able to say this is the element that is essential to the individual as such, which is precisely individuality. So the individuality of the individual pertains solely to the property of intensive quantity, not to divide without changing its nature. Now, what this is to say is that diminution, which is division of intensive quantity, consists, as Deleuze understands it, in the change of the nature of the intensity and of the formality that follows upon the intensity. So what this is to say is that what Deleuze is arguing for in his notion of individuality is that the inability to be further divided while maintaining your nature, which is instantiation, is exactly what is meant by individuality, which allows us to say that the most primitive way that Deleuze understands what individuality is as non-instantiability. The element of individuality itself is the very impossibility of instantiation, non-instantiability. So when we've said this most primitive part, of the notion of individuality, we're then able to say all of the various resources that have provided for the ways in which we have numerically distinct, qualitatively varied entities within experience, provide for a second part of the account of individuality. Um, but what is prior and is the necessary supplement to these various brilliant accounts of the way in which the individual differences within experience are formed is to explain this, their element of individuality itself. Why it is that they're individual as opposed to syntheses of general terms. And it's insufficient. It's just as insufficient as it was for analogy to assume, in a nominalistic sense, their individuality or their non-instantiability to then talk about how it is that we have various syntheses that constitute identities that are numerically distinct, that divide a concept and all of these various elements, and so are relatively indivisible, that are which we predicate, whatever. All of those various elements of individuality are posterior to the most primitive way of understanding individuality, both as argued for in Gracia and as now, as we've understood via Proclus, argued for in Difference and Repetition. So we're now able to give some kind of account of how it is that intensities are formed, which is to give an account of individuality itself, which is that which analogy ostensibly was unable to account for in, as we argued for in the first part. And it is it's then from this element of individuality itself. Out of this will then come numerical diversity, relative identity within experience, all of the various syntheses that we would point to within these elements of dramatization that have been excellently pointed out by the prevailing literature on Deleuze's account of individuality. So we will say in as we said in on pages 38 and 39, what Deleuze wants to do is to say being being in a univocal sense of pure difference. This this pure difference we can see on page 183 of Difference and Repetition. This pure difference is that of initially is that of the idea. So he says the indetermination of the virtual. So it's not its actual determination or differentiation in actual entity. This indetermination renders possible the manifestation of difference freed from all subordination. So the absolute concept of difference is whatever it is that Deleuze is going to mean by the idea, which he variably specifies as the problematic field, as the pre-individual, etc., etc. This problematic field, the field of problems and questions that makes up the virtual in Deleuze's philosophy, is going to be that out of which we have an imminent generation of, in the ultimate analysis, intensity, which is going to be the being of individuality as such. There's been an enormous amount of literature work trying to understand just what's going on in chapter 4 of Difference and Repetition, which is on ideas and the synthesis of difference, which is precisely working out this ontogenetic movement from the pre-individual to the third element of sufficient reason, which is intensity. So I won't pretend as though I'm going to give anything close to a full analysis. Rather, I'll just sketch what Deleuze does over the course of this chapter. He says, if we understand problems um, as having their first of all, their determinable elements, and then the reciprocal determination of these elements, finally resulting in the complete determination of these elements in terms of values for the reciprocal relation. This is by using this extensive metaphor of of differential calculus. This is how it is that we are to account for the origination out of problems and questions of their imminent specification, which generates the cases of solution, which is the complete determination of the problem. What's important for us to note is that um, this pure multiplicity of virtual singular points um, that specifies the being of the problem, this distinctive kind of question mark being or non being in parentheses that he references over and over again in difference and repetition. That the term of the specification of the imminent specification of the problem is individuality. Um, it's helpful here to point to um, two related projects. One of them in Alfred North Whitehead's Process and Reality. Um, Whitehead argues that we have a subject, we have primitively a subject which is in the process of resolving a certain question that is the process of its concrescence into an actual occasion, wherein it will become a superject in his, idiosyncratic terminology, and so become a datum of feeling for further concrescence of subjects. And this process really is a process of individuation, in as much as the actual entity at the end of the day, the actual event, is determined as individuality. And yet, so this seems to be very closely related to the imminent specification of the problem field of the virtual in Deleuze, out of which individuality arises as the complete determination of the problem, which is the solution. And yet, within Deleuze, we presuppose no already individuated identity. Within Whitehead, there is a kind of positing of the subject, although we've said it's actually causally related prior to prior concrescences and prior and so is capable of being a locus of feeling and whatnot. Still, this the subject as a locus is something that is presupposed, and what is involved in the genesis of it as a subject is something that Whitehead doesn't explain thoroughly in Process and Reality. So there's a kind of similar concern in Process and Reality that is related to the kind of concern that Deleuze has noted with the analogical understanding of the individuation of being, which is that it seems as though we've presupposed the term of analysis, which is individuality in some sense, in order to then give an account of what we wanted to explain, which is the actual occasion or actual entity as individuality on the whole. So Deleuze is trying to give an account in terms of pure difference, entirely pre-individual, using Simondon's terminology, and so does not contain individuality at the onset, but is that by which, through its own immanent specification, the being of individuality as intensive quantity or as intensity will arise. And we might see this this being of difference at the ground of identity prior to identity as very similar to the way that Schelling in the philosophical investigations into the essence of human freedom understands the ground of God's being. And yet in Deleuze, this difference, this irreducible remainder, to quote from Schelling's work, is never compensated by the Empedoclean act of love, which brings identity at the in the final analysis. Whereas Schelling will argue that it does. What we have entirely is pure difference in the form of the problem or question in its own immanent specification without any prior identity, without any prior individuality, the term of which is the complete determination of the question, which is meant to be the being of individuality as such. So, what is distinctive here is that the being of individuality as such is not yet individual difference. So, this is why it is that on page 38, Deleuze has argued that individuating difference is prior to even individual differences within being. So the way that we can understand the immediacy with which Deleuze claims being is related to individuating difference is not that it is in this final analysis incomplete determination specified into so many various individuals, but rather this is individuating difference. This is pure individuality. So in the middle in the middle place, we want to abstract from the process of ontogenesis that Deleuze is arguing for, and we want to look at this one moment at the crossroads between between the virtuals being actualized into the various forms of extensity and quality. We have the element of individuality, which is intensity. The element of individuality that will remain within everything that follows in all of the actualization that will occur after the fact. So all of the actualization that will occur will be various articulations, modal differences, perhaps, of a particular deployment of individuality that is the specification of the problem or question. Um, and so from here, we're able to say, where does numerical distinction then arise? And this is actually rather easily stated. The numerical distinction arises because in the first moments of actualization, wherein difference or intensity is canceled outside of itself, to use Deleuze's terminology. In the first moments of this actualization, what we have is difference deployed in actual entity, all of which maintains the uncancelable intensity as difference in itself, merely embodying this in a cancellation outside of itself. So all of the various entities that are so deployed within the explication of intensity, as Deleuze argues, will be numerically distinct in the first instance because they are simply the actualization of differences in negative differences, relative differences um, of the what is a primitive pre-individual or a primitive individuality on the whole as the first moment of this phase of being. Um, what this allows us to say is that Deleuze's concept of the univocity of being, said of pure difference itself, where this difference is understood as a becoming, as an ontogenesis, and as pure difference, finally resolving itself into the moment of intensity, allows us to give an account of the actual individuality as in non-instantiability of entities without presupposing non-instantiability at the onset as a primitive term or as non-analyzable. Rather, there's an analysis that occurs within Deleuze's philosophy, and the entirety of being will then be the unfolding of a phase of this individuality that does not cancel individuality, but articulates it and deploys it into various forms of identity, articulated by different by negativity. Um, I want to leave off with one quote from Deleuze that helps us to understand um, that this is not the end of this is not the end of the story, though. We don't have an emptying of being outside of itself. Um, we don't have the merely univocal sense of being said once, um, out of which a true variety of entities then comes that we then have to address as various different ways of being because they are all articulated by the negative in different forms of identity. Um, Deleuze says on page 244 of Difference and Repetition that if the eternal return reduces qualities to the status of pure signs and retains of extensities only what combines with original depth, even at the cost of our coherence and in favor of a superior coherence, then the most beautiful qualities will appear, the most brilliant colors, the most precious stones, and the most vibrant extensions. For once reduced to their seminal reasons, and having broken all relation with the negative by being reduced to the seminal reasons of intensity itself, pure individuality, these forms of identity, extensity, and quality will remain forever affixed in the intensive space of positive differences. So, what Deleuze argues for is that in the negative, in this repetition of this repetition of the becoming of being, um, uh, the pure third repetition of the empty form of time, as he argues for in the second chapter of the work, um, leaves us not with a ground relation that would preserve at the end of the day the grounded as much as the ground of the pure past and the present, um, but in fact eliminates entirely that form of the ground relation where we have the pure groundlessness of positive differences and the effacement of the negative in the final analysis. So this this gives us Deleuze's account of individuation by telling us a little bit about what um, the about that to which being is said in a univocal sense, in order to then account for individuation, and that is all.